On a frost-kissed evening in December 2025, the ancient walls of Windsor Castle once again played host to one of the most symbolically loaded state banquets in recent British history. Crystal chandeliers bathed St. George's Hall in warm amber light, winter roses perfumed the air, and a string quartet wove Beethoven's ode to joy through the murmur of diplomats, politicians, and aristocrats. King Charles III, still bearing the quiet marks of his recent cancer treatment, raised a glass to the enduring Anglo-German friendship. At his side sat German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier, with First Lady Elke Budenbender opposite Queen Camilla, who fiddled gracefully with a magnificent sapphire brooch that had once belonged to Queen Victoria. Everything about the evening had been choreographed to the last detail: the horseshoe table for 170 guests, the poached turbot, the Windsor pheasant, the raspberry soufflé, the liveried footmen moving in perfect silence. Yet beneath the polished ritual, a subtle but unmistakable shift was taking place, one that would be crystallized in a single sentence delivered by the German president. When Steinmeier rose to speak, his English was, as always, impeccable. He thanked the king for his hospitality, praised the historic reconciliation between their nations, and reaffirmed joint commitment to Ukraine and the green transition. Then, turning with a warm smile to the woman seated on his right, he said, "Allow me also to express my profound gratitude to Queen Catherine, who sits beside me today. She has taken remarkable steps to strengthen the partnership between our two nations. I wish her every success in her new role within the British monarchy." A hush deeper than any silence the quartet could produce fell across the hall. He had called the Princess of Wales Queen Catherine, and he had not mentioned Queen Camilla at all. For a moment, the only sound was the faint clink of a nervous guest setting down a wine glass. King Charles's smile remained fixed in place, though those close enough caught the briefest tightening at the corners of his eyes. Queen Camilla, seated several places further along the curve of the table in the Burmese ruby tiara and a gown of deep midnight blue, continued her conversation with Elke Budenbender as if nothing had happened. But everyone in the room knew something had. The seating itself had already raised eyebrows among protocol watchers. Normally, the place of honor to the right of a male head of state is occupied by the queen consort or the most senior female royal. Yet there sat Catherine, radiant in a pale blue silk gown and, for the first time in public, the rarely worn Indian circlet tiara, a piece last seen on Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Her placement was deliberate, approved months in advance by the Lord Chamberlain's office, and it signaled that the Princess of Wales was no longer merely the future queen but an active player in the present diplomatic firmament. Steinmeier's slip, or was it a slip, ignited an instant media firestorm. Within minutes, #Queen Catherine was trending worldwide. By the time the final coffee cups were cleared, it had overtaken every other topic on British X. Commentators pored over replays of the speech, freeze-framing the exact moment the German president turned to Catherine with unmistakable warmth. Some insisted it was a simple linguistic error. Steinmeier's otherwise flawless English had momentarily defaulted to the informal German habit of using queen for any senior royal woman. Others pointed out that his briefing pack, prepared jointly by the Foreign Office and the Palace, had reportedly begun referring to Catherine internally as Her Majesty the Princess of Wales, designate, in anticipation of future eventualities. Whatever the truth, the words could not be unsaid. In the days that followed, royal correspondents unearthed a pattern that made the incident feel less accidental and more inevitable. Since recovering from her own cancer diagnosis in 2024, Catherine had quietly but systematically expanded her diplomatic footprint. She had led a major early-year symposium in Berlin, hosted Anglo-German tech roundtables on green energy, and become the public face of several joint initiatives on children's mental health. Trade figures showed bilateral relations at their strongest since Brexit, with annual turnover nudging £150 billion, and many of the new agreements bore the discreet imprint of her royal foundation. When President Macron visited in the spring of 2025, Catherine had again been seated to his right. When the American president came in the autumn, the same. The Windsor banquet simply made public what palace insiders had been whispering for months. The Princess of Wales was being groomed not just for a future reign, but for a quasi-regal role in the here and now. Queen Camilla, by contrast, had begun a gentle withdrawal from the most intense spotlight. At 78, and after standing steadfastly by Charles through his illness, sources close to the household suggested she was content to focus on her passions, literacy, domestic violence prevention, osteopathy, while gradually ceding the more glamorous, diplomatic stage to the younger generation. Her approval ratings, hard-won after decades of vilification, had stabilized in the mid-40s, respectable but no longer growing. Catherine's, meanwhile, hovered consistently above 70%, often reaching 75% in the latest YouGov trackers. The British public, it seemed, had made its preference clear. None of this is to say that Camilla was being sidelined in any crude or unkind way. On the contrary, the transition appeared remarkably gracious. During the carriage procession earlier that day, the two women had emerged in coordinated royal blue, laughing together as they waved to the crowds. At the banquet itself, television cameras caught Camilla leaning across to squeeze Catherine's hand in what looked very much like a gesture of blessing. Yet symbols matter in monarchy, and the symbolism of the evening was unmistakable. The baton was passing. Historians were quick to draw parallels. When the young Princess Elizabeth returned from Kenya in 1952 to become queen, her mother instantly stepped back from center stage, adopting the title Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and a supporting role. Queen Mary had done the same in 1936. The British monarchy has always understood that survival depends on controlled, dignified evolution rather than abrupt rupture. What happened in St. George's Hall on that December night was simply the latest chapter in a very old story. By breakfast the next morning, the German president's office had issued a clarification. President Steinmeier had intended no breach of protocol and apologized for any confusion caused by his warm but imprecise phrasing. Buckingham Palace echoed the sentiment, describing the remarks as much appreciated recognition of the Princess of Wales's tireless work. Yet neither statement quelled the speculation. On the contrary, they seemed almost perfunctory, as if everyone understood that the truth lay somewhere between courtesy and revelation. Across the country, the public reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Monarchists hailed the seamless generosity of the transition. Younger commentators celebrated the arrival of a modern, empathetic face at the heart of the institution. Even Republicans found it hard to criticize an arrangement that looked less like palace plotting and more like natural succession. Polls taken in the immediate aftermath showed support for the monarchy ticking upward for the first time in 2 years. With Catherine cited by 62% of respondents as the royal they most admired. In the end, the 2025 German state visit will be remembered less for the turbot or the tiaras than for a single sentence spoken in perfect English by a courteous head of state who may, or may not, have let the future slip out a few years early. Whether by accident or design, Frank-Walter Steinmeier had publicly anointed the next queen of the United Kingdom long before most people expected the ceremony to take place. And in the gilded hush of St. George's Hall, as the chandeliers flickered and the winter roses began to droop, the British monarchy turned another quiet page in its 1,000-year history.